the US greenhouse gas emissions peaked in 2007. We're already decarbonizing pretty significantly. Not fast enough, but very materially. And so what we should really understand is how are we decarbonizing? Or what's working? What are we going to keep doing next year and the year after? And how do we just do more of it faster and better?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the CleanTechies Podcast. This is episode 73 of the show. I'm your host Silas Maynor and thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. Before we get into the details, we want to hear quickly a note for founders listening and then a quick note from our sponsors. So if you are a founder in the space seeking funding or looking for partnerships, please consider reaching out. We are always glad to make introductions to any of the capital partners that we are aware of. We are constantly building this network out, so glad to make any introductions there. And then we also often make introductions to potential partnerships. So if this is a space you're looking for potential partners to help break into the market a little bit faster, feel free to reach out. Always glad to facilitate that. And then thank you to NextWave Partners for sponsoring this show. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across ClimateTech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you are looking to make a career change, reach out to them at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. Additionally, NextWave has also pretty recently offered to do free consultations with anyone affected by the recent layoffs in tech who are seeking to get into the climate tech space. So again, if you were laid off from tech and you are interested in getting into the climate tech space, feel free to reach out to one of their consultants and they'll be glad to do what they can to offer advice, tricks, and tips to get your next role, hopefully very soon, in climate tech. So with that, let's get into today's episode details. Today we are joined by Bruce Usher, who is currently a professor at Columbia, past CEO of EcoSecurities Group, and author of Investing in the Era of Climate Change. We spoke a lot about a lot of different things today with Bruce, but overall, I think the key topics were, one, how the investment community and general public's opinion has really shifted over the past 20 years as relates to climate. He's been in this space for quite some time, at least in terms of sustainability and investing, I should say. And I think his perspective was quite interesting. We also did spend a bunch of time speaking about the different technologies out there, which ones are ready, which ones need to be developed more, where he sees the gaps going forward. And I thought that was quite fascinating as well, given his perspective and how he's been investing in these types of things for quite some time. So I thought that was quite interesting. And then finally, we also spoke about what he saw at COP27 as he was attending, and then also went in a little bit to detail around the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, as he was able to shed a bit of light in some of his thoughts on the legislation and what it can really mean for the future of climate tech in the US. Generally speaking, really insightful conversation from the perspective of somebody who has been in space longer than most, and really excited to be able to share this with you. So without any further delay, let's get into our discussion with Bruce. All right, welcome to the show, Bruce. How are you doing today?
I'm well. Thanks very much, Silas.
Absolutely. I'm glad to have you on. I think it's going to be exciting to have you speak about with the things we're going to go over today. So let's just get right into it and start with a little bit about yourself, maybe some of your accomplishments as well.
So my background is both traditional and non-traditional. I actually grew up in Canada. I think I put that in traditional category. I moved to the US in 1990 after spending 4 years in Japan, in Tokyo, where I first worked in finance. And I came to the US to go to business school, which I enjoyed, and stayed here. And like a lot of people, you come to New York City, you sign a 1-year lease, and next thing you know, 30 years gone by. So here I am, and I had a very again pretty traditional finance career in the sense that I worked for some big banks. I really enjoyed the work, but after several years, I really wanted to do something more entrepreneurial, and I had an opportunity to become an entrepreneur, and actually became an entrepreneur 3 times. And the third time around, something slightly different happened, which is I was involved in not exactly a startup, but pretty close to a startup. And this company is what we now call a social enterprise. It had a dual mission, which was to be profitable business, and have social impact. And specifically, it was impact on climate change. And that was a real awakening for me. I'd never come across this idea that you could both be in business and have social impact. It was all new to me. This is a long time ago. This is back in 2002, 20 years ago. And that awakening is sort of what set the rest of the trajectory of my career. That company eventually did well, was acquired, and after that, I became an academic. But my area of focus is on social enterprise.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm just a little bit curious. So how did you come across the opportunity in the climate side of things? And you mentioned that it's not something you had necessarily thought about prior to that. Was there ever anything prior to that kind of like, once you got into this space, you looked back and you said, you know what, actually, like I've been thinking about this, like there's some things that line up, because I'm usually curious to figure out that.
Yes, Silas, I wish I could say, it was in my head, or, I was an environmentalist from a young age. I wish I had some beautiful story to tell you. I don't. But I did have something going for me, and that was my brother. So he was, I don't know if I would say I would say he's an environmentalist. He's a couple years younger than me, and in college he was an engineer, but he worked on solar. So this is back in the late 80s and 90s. In those days, solar was pretty radical. He was part of the first teams that raced the solar-powered vehicle across Australia's outback. In those days, if you just finished, you were a winner. And he was in solar. I thought, well, that's a really odd, curious thing, but whatever. Didn't think much about it. And I mentioned I've been an entrepreneur 3 times. So the first 2 businesses were really around finance and tech. And after the second business was acquired, it wasn't that big a business, but it was acquired. It was a good outcome. And I didn't like working for the company that bought it. It just wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. And so I left after a few months. I just sort of resigned and walked away. And I didn't have a plan with what to do next. It was kind of the first time in my life I didn't really know what was next in the cards for me. And one of the people reached out to was my brother. I mean, we talked all the time, but I said, Eric, all I know is finance, and I know something about starting companies and running businesses. Tell me more about your work in renewables. And at that point, he was working on climate change, and who can I talk to? And so he put me in touch with a bunch of people. And again, this is back in 2002. And I made an assumption. It was an incorrect assumption. My assumption was that anyone who cared about climate change had no interest in talking to someone like me. The classic Wall Street guy. I mean, I worked for Lehman Brothers at one point, doesn't get sort of more Wall Streety than that. And he introduced me, he just sort of said, well, here's a list of people you should reach out to. And one of those people had co-founded this company called EcoSecurities. It was probably the world's one of the first, maybe the first, one of the first carbon credit companies, which today people talk about carbon credits a lot, but back in 2002, this was really innovative stuff. And when I got to understand what they were trying to do, I was fascinated. And more importantly for me, they were interested in me. They were like, your experience raising money, investing money, and running an early stage business and growing it is what they needed. And so in fact, they brought me in as CEO to actually sort of run it. And that was an extraordinary opportunity. In fact, we grew that to about 300 people. We actually went public in 2005. It was incredible business. Some of the smartest, most wonderful people I've ever worked with. And so that got me in. So long answer to your question, Silas, it was my brother that he was the one who really had the right ideas, not me.
Yeah, now, I think it's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic, coming from a younger brother, as you mentioned. I'm the oldest of many kids, and I kind of look forward to the time when my younger brothers will probably show me a thing or two. Right. For now, I try to show them.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. No, it's good to learn. That's what part of the family is all about. The irony of the story is that over many years, he still works on climate change. He works for the UN. He actually runs a pretty important part of the UN called UNEP-FI, and over the years, he sort of gravitated more towards my sphere. He's really learned a lot about finance and business, and really, really has a deep knowledge now of how finance can really help address climate change and what the levers are to do that. And I've gravitated towards pure finance into climate change is really, really extraordinarily important. It's the greatest challenge of the time. And so we've kind of met somewhere in the middle. And this is wonderful because we literally talk every week. He actually lives in Europe, based in Stockholm. We talk every week about our work because it now intersects right in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it is a really important intersection. Obviously, it's something we're seeing a lot more of recently, with people understanding that it's really hard to get people to give up things. But if you can point it out to that there's actually a benefit and things to be had if we take the action, it's a lot easier to get people moving in the same direction. But I do, before we get into too deep of the technical stuff, I really want to go and have you give us a quick summary of your book. I would like to know a little bit about the big details and what people can look into.
So let me begin by again going back to the history that the question asked before, because it's connected to the book, right? So I get involved in the sector in 2002, and I come in thinking, "Wow, this is really exciting. We can apply finance to this problem of climate change." What I didn't realize at the time is there wasn't actually a lot that we could invest in. In fact, there was very little to do. Now, obviously, there was concerns. There wasn't much capital either. Very few people were investing. But one of the reasons was there was just nothing to invest in. I mean, renewable energy was insanely expensive back then. I remember looking at some of the first solar projects and thinking, this will never work. This is not going to replace fossil fuels. I mean, it's tiny and super costly. And I really thought, forget it. And then, electric vehicles didn't exist really. I guess golf carts, maybe. I don't know. There was nothing to invest in, right? So you had some government policy. There was some support. I mean, certainly we understood the climate science plenty well 20 years ago. The science has gotten better, but we knew what was going on. But there wasn't much capital, and there was nothing to put it in. Fast forward to today, and what's really changed is the opportunity to put capital to work and the capital that's looking to invest in the sector. So we now have extraordinary climate, what I call climate solutions, renewable energy. Wind and solar today are the cheapest forms, the best forms of power in most of the world, fastest growing the source of power generation. And really just, these are extraordinary products. They're distributable, they're cheap, they're clean, obviously. And then you've got electric vehicles. Electric vehicle, again, is a better product than the incumbent product. It's not cheaper yet, right? But it will be pretty soon. But it turns out to be a better product. Almost everybody who drives an electric vehicle, prefers it. It's more fun, better car, less maintenance. So those alone, if you just take renewables and electrification of transportation, ground transportation, those two things alone are close to $1 trillion a year in investment. And if we scaled them globally, would reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by about 50% globally. And then the other 50%, the products aren't yet commercially competitive to replace the polluting products that we have today. And they're certainly not at scale, but they exist. They're technologically feasible. I'm talking about things like green hydrogen, for example, or low carbon cement, or sustainable aviation fuels, or even direct air capture, although that one's really on the extreme. And there's a lot of funding going into those as well. It's early stage sort of risk capital, we call venture capital. So what I thought about 2 years ago when I started, because it takes 2 years to write a book and get it published. I started working this 2 years ago. What I realized was that the general understanding of what's going on in business and climate change and the reality were a total disconnect. In other words, most people thought very little money was being invested, and whatever was being invested was going into products that, were super expensive or crappy or, we're never going to scale. And that's just not the reality. That's not what's going on. And so I thought I should write a book that pretty much anyone can read. It's not a textbook. It's not that technical, but isn't based on wishful thinking, isn't based on where we need to get to in the next 30 years. So I write about that because it's obviously still a massive challenge ahead of us. It's based on what's happening today. And then I also want to write about, it's not a one size fits all. So there's a lot of investment going on. There's a lot of products being invested, but there are many different ways to do that. And my belief is there's not one strategy for everybody. Some investors are very cautious. Some investors have a lot of capital to invest. Some have less. Some are in the US, some are not. Some are looking at, very simple things, some want more complexity. And so I break those down into 5 different strategies, and the book sort of lays those out. And then the last thing I read about is the importance of investing. If you care about climate change, and I think I hope everybody does eventually, how you invest as an individual, or if you happen to work in the financial service industry, job, makes a huge difference, because we've essentially spent 300 years building a global economy that's pretty effective for most people. I mean, the average human today is 50 times better off than pre-industrial revolution in terms of food and transport and heating and things like this. But there's a catch, right? The catch, it's unsustainable. We've got about 30 years to decarbonize the entire global economy. And you can't decarbonize an economy without essentially rebuilding the economy. And you can't rebuild the economy without investment. And if investors step up and put capital to work, and we keep scaling the products we got, solar, wind, electric vehicles, and keep developing the new products that are coming along, we can avoid catastrophic climate change. We really can. I believe that. That doesn't mean we will. And sort of bridging that gap between we can, we will, investment plays a big part of that. Now, investment is not alone, right? You need business, you need consumers to make the right the right purchase decisions, and you need the right government policies. This does not happen in a vacuum. I do not believe the private sector, the markets, will solve climate change. You need government policies, like the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that's a great piece of legislation, and I'm very pleased to have seen that. So there's a lot of moving pieces here. It's not investment alone, but I felt the investment story hadn't been told very well from my perspective, and I thought it was important to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, from what I was researching the book, I didn't get a chance to read it yet, but from what I was understanding, it seems like you have a pretty optimistic outlook, which I think is kind of uncharacteristic of a lot of climate-related books. So I just wanted to, maybe if you want to comment on that and the optimism in that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Silas. So I teach a climate finance course at Columbia Business School. I have for about, since 2009. It's been a while now. And literally a couple of weeks ago, a student put up her hand and she says, one of the things I like about this course is that it's optimistic. And it took me back, that actually I was taken a little bit by surprise, because she said that, and you also said your understanding was this book's optimistic, because I don't think it is optimistic. I think it's realistic. Like, in other words, I don't view I'm a pessimist about climate change or an optimist about climate change. I just write what I know and try to back it up with facts and figures that underpin those points. I think we can address catastrophic, and I'm not making this up. They're based on analysis of deep experts, whether it's consulting firms or scientists or others. We can avoid catastrophic climate change. I don't know that we will, to be honest. And my the area that I'm most concerned about, again, I'm not pessimistic about it, I'm just most concerned about, is the policy side of it. So 20 years ago, we had some policy, we had no technology, and we had no capital. 20 years, today we have technologies and we got lots of capital. The policy part has gotten a little better, but not much. And the problem is, climate change is a global problem, right? It's like a tragedy of the commons on a global scale. It affects everybody everywhere, and it doesn't matter where you pollute, you're going to harm everybody. So at the end of the day, you need some sort of global cooperation, right? And my biggest concern today is that's not happening. As nation states, we haven't been too good at working together ever. And in recent years, our willingness to work together has simply declined. The rise of nationalism and other, and you simply have to look at how we as nation states address COVID, and we didn't cooperate. We immediately, moved into our borders and our shells and closed down. Climate change is not the same as COVID and the pandemic, but the fact is we'd be much better off if we really cooperated. I recently attended the COP27 annual meeting in this one in Egypt. Yeah, there's some things that came out of it that I think are helpful, but to a certain extent, it's just further evidence of the inability of countries to cooperate on this issue, and that worries me.
Yeah, I guess why don't we go into that now while we're on the topic? Is you want to talk a little bit more about your experiences there? I guess I'm kind of keen to understand what positive things did come out of it, what was like really productive, if any specific points, and what generally speaking was the sentiment, and then what your takeaways were in terms of things that may happen or may not happen over the coming year.
So let's start with the positive, and it's, from my perspective, not a huge positive. I don't think it's meriting quite the response it's getting. So in other words, most of my comments on COP are not going to be terribly positive. The agreement right at the end, well, after the end, but at the end, on a loss and damages fund, I view this as a positive because of the signal it sends. The signal it sends is, well, for 300 years, developed countries, and now China, which I would characterize developed country, though there's some argument on that. We've grown our economies by putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and now countries that didn't do that, people who didn't participate in that, are suffering the consequences. Whether it's recent flooding in Pakistan or other areas, right? There's clearly an injustice here. There's no question about that. And the loss and damage fund is the first time that these nation states have gotten together and agreed that, in fact, that's the case, and a willingness to actually do something about it. Okay, so I think that's a positive. Just the recognition of that is a big deal. Now we get to the reality. The reality is setting up a fund, like, that's, as hard as that was, that's nothing compared to actually finding the money, let alone actually spending it or providing it. It's not really spent, but allocating it in a way that's equitable and helps to address this injustice. I'm not terribly hopeful. In 2009, the developed world promised $100 billion a year in development aid to developing countries around climate change, and it took over a decade to actually come up with the money. And the way they came up with it is mostly creative bookkeeping, if you ask me. It's not a lot of incremental dollars or euros or yen. So yeah, look, it was a good outcome, but it's not that big a deal. What I was disappointed about with this COP is this was billed as the implementation COP. In other words, no one expected some new Paris Agreement or anything like that. It wasn't. No one was working on that. What they were supposedly working on was, how do you take what was already previously agreed to, like the Paris Agreement, and continue to improve on it, refine it, implement it. It's the implementation COP. And I don't think we moved the ball too much down the field, to use the American metaphor. There's, and here's one of the things I kept hearing over and over that honestly bothered me. There was a lot of people talking about what was not being done. Not enough money is being invested. Not enough emissions are being reduced. That was the tone of so many of the discussions. And I think there's a place for that. We need to make sure that we recognize what it is that we need to do. But I don't find it highly productive. And the analogy I use is, when I teach a course, I don't teach about what people are not doing. I teach what people are doing, and then dive in to figure out what's working and what's not. And obviously, if stuff's working, how do you do more of it? And if it's not working, well, why not? What do we learn from that? And how do we change so we don't keep doing stuff that's not working? To me, that's what's productive. But at the COP, you don't have a lot of discussion around that. And the important point here is, an awful lot is being done, right? Industries are decarbonizing, not fast enough. But if we simply say, you're not doing enough, that doesn't help us. We should be saying, how are you going to do what you're doing now? How are you going to do more faster? Let me give you an example. The US, most people don't know this. The US greenhouse gas emissions peaked in 2007. We're already decarbonizing pretty significantly. Not fast enough, but very materially. And so what we should really understand is how are we decarbonizing? Or what's working? What are we going to keep doing, next year and the year after? And how do we just do more of it faster and better? And who's decarbonized faster? I can tell you the UK decarbonized faster than we did. How did they do that? What can we learn from them? To me, this is where we can really accomplish that. And you don't see that a lot, that discussion at COP. In fact, pretty much none.
Yeah, it's kind of sad that they're not taking the advantage of the opportunities of there has been a lot of work done. They should be discussing, hey, at least, let's not so much focus on the moonshots that we might be looking at, but let's focus on what's doable and at least at a bare minimum share notes that what we can do locally. Because I do think that to some extent, there's always going to be a certain level of resistance when you try to do something as a global movement, because there's a lot of people who just aren't interested. With plenty in America, especially, right? They're just not
Absolutely.
interested.
Yeah. And I think we have to think of that. There's a number of different groups out there, and I think we have to be careful of thinking, who's for climate change, just mitigating climate change, who's not. There's a lot of groups. One group are the climate deniers, right? And as far as I'm concerned, I don't have anything to say to them. Like, someone else can deal with that. They're getting smaller, thank goodness, but they're still there. The other extreme are those who have given up, and that's a growing group. In other words, there's a growing number of people, and it tends to be a younger generation. And I'm really inspired by the younger generation. That's why I teach. But there is a growing group who says, it's hopeless. I'm just giving up, and that doesn't help either. Because if you give up, it's pretty self-fulfilling prophecy. We're in big trouble. So that's unhelpful. And then you get another group, and this is, I think, important in the context of like the climate change meeting, COP27. There's another very large group where they recognize the importance of climate change, but they have greater, more immediate challenges. And I think we don't really understand this group very well. And I actually think this is a very, very large group. It may frankly be the majority of the human population at the moment. Extreme example of that is, I don't think I'm not sure too many people in Ukraine are going to prioritize climate change right now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to state the obvious there, but in many other countries as well, there are bigger challenges, whether it's food security or housing or things. And you could say, well, climate change is going to make that worse, or you should really care. And that person could say, yes, I hear you and I even believe you, but I have to deal with the immediate. I got to get by through today or this week or this month or even this year. And, we need to understand that, because I think ignoring that or telling people they're wrong, that's not gonna help us really move this forward.
Yeah. I think I think it's something that's come up a number of times where you've got potentially incremental, I guess, growth towards the outcome that's desired, but some of the people who are really, really extreme on, hey, I think that's the Sierra Club has been accused of doing this a few times, where it's like, oh, that's not enough, so we're not going to be interested, right? So you end up having these negotiations that you're trying to get to 100%, which takes so long that if you would have just incrementally gone there and proven, kind of like in a business, right? If you're going to start a new business unit, you need to prove a little bit of how it's actually achieving, and then go into it. Because I think that there's this idea that we can, as policymakers and things, just do things one time right off the bat and it's going to be perfect. And usually it's not the case. There needs to be adjustments made. And in this case, now we've got so many examples globally. I mean, Europe's so very far ahead of us in a lot of these things, and we can take examples of what did they do well, what didn't they do well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And also other countries. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa, obviously, really different issues, but because a lot of their economies are off-grid, big energy challenges, there's a lot to learn there too, right? How they're particularly in the off-grid environment. Look at China and India. Now, here's another issue that I think people make a mistake, and I'll be blunt about that. They talk about the developed world and the developing world. And in the climate context, I don't think that fits at all anymore. You have the US, Europe, put Canada, Australia, Japan into that category. Then you have, the petro states like Russia, some of the Middle East. They're a whole different world altogether. Then you got China. China, first of all, is a third of global emissions, so it's number one that matters. But they also, they've got both their own solutions and their own challenges. And we need to look at China in isolation. And then there's India. India is still a relatively small percentage, but it's the fastest growing. And it's doing some really interesting things, some great stuff happening, particularly on the renewables area and smaller EVs. Like you look at sort of 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers, man, that market's really incredible in India. But it's got its challenges. And then you've got, really the lesser developed countries, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South America. Oh, and then I would also put in a different category altogether, Brazil. Right? Brazil with the Amazon, a whole different story of opportunities and challenges. So we have to be very careful not to sort of bifurcate the rich and the poor. That this global north and global south. I understand where it comes from, and I'm just very, certainly understand the history there that creates that division, but it's not that helpful in the current context. We need to understand these separate, really separate issues in each of these areas.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of difficulties and a lot of things that people need to be considerate of. Is that maybe even perhaps we want to change, and maybe one of the challenges could be, and I could be wrong on this, but just hypothesizing here. You put together a fund like this, but how many countries are actually going to want to work with you on this, and how are you going to actually make it successful? Where you might want to just kind of make people in those countries enabled to do this themselves, right, and build their own wealth out of it, because it can actually provide great opportunities. So
absolutely, the best way to do that is to bring it down to that local level, for sure. Right?
Yeah, certainly.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah.
No, it's okay. That's where I wanted to go with it. So I want to talk about if we can kind of divide this into two things. So you obviously, we talked earlier about it's realistic that we can essentially avoid catastrophic climate change. You believe we can, right? Whether or not we will, another story. But could you talk to us a little bit about which are the big solutions that are already there? You sort of mentioned it in the beginning, but I'd be keen to break it down into the technologies already in place in industries that can be decarbonized, and then the ones that still need a bit of work. You want to divide it into those two sections.
Yeah. So the one that's just simplest, clearest is renewable wind and solar together. And I would sort of layer into that energy storage, essentially battery storage, which is an important part of the intermittency of those technologies. The challenge there is really a simple one, which is putting that infrastructure in place. In many countries, especially the US, especially Europe, you run into a lot of barriers around permitting and construction. It's just really hard to build stuff in this country. And that's slowing everything down dramatically. People don't realize just how much of a problem that is. But in terms of the technologies, the capital, it's pretty straightforward. And the electrical grid globally will go mostly renewables in the coming decades. It's almost a certainty at this point, not just because of climate change, but simply for cost reasons. It's because it's the cheapest form of power, and even the fossil fuel companies, oil and gas companies, are all projecting, that renewables will dominate the energy industry in the future. It's just a question of how fast and once you get over about 80% renewable, you do start to have some bigger challenges around intermittency, but it's pretty much there. The electric vehicles is interesting because the price points are still a bit too high, and the past year or two of supply chain constraints and a lot of issues around batteries that has created sort of a stress on the growth in that sector. The growth is the stress is not around consumer demand. I mean, consumers just can't get enough of these vehicles. It's in the production side, which is an interesting problem to have, because for years we were like, how do we convince consumers to buy cleaner products? And now we can't ship them fast enough. But that should resolve itself in the next couple of years. The big challenge around EVs is the charging infrastructure. It's a pretty big challenge. But again, it's not that big a technical challenge. And here's an important thing to understand about these climate solutions technologies is they're all connected. So the more renewables you have, the more clean power you got to fuel your EV fleet. The more EVs you have, the more backup power you have for intermittency that goes with renewables. So to give you an example, the Ford F-150 Lightning, which is an electric pickup truck. And this is an amazing vehicle because Ford took its best-selling vehicle of all time. Basically, every dollar that Ford makes in profit is because that one truck, the Ford F-150. It's a really popular truck. And they were willing to cannibalize their own best-selling product with an electric version. That's a pretty ballsy move. And it appears to be paying off. That Lightning is extraordinarily popular. One reason it might be popular is it's got a plug in it. And you can plug your F-150 Lightning into anything. You can plug it back into your house. And if you live anywhere where the grid seems to go out, people live in rural communities, that certainly happens. Well, sometimes urban too, but more rural. It'll charge your home. In fact, that Ford F-150, it'll power your home, everything in your home. Like we're talking fridges, TVs, everything for about 3 days. So it's not just like, oh, I get a little bit, like 3 days. That's a lot of power. So the reason I tell a little story is electric vehicles are essentially energy storage devices on wheels, batteries on wheels, and they're moving around. This allows us to actually help balance the grid because most vehicles are driven less than 23 hours a day. Sorry, less than 1 hour a day. They're not driven 23 hours a day. So they're sitting there with energy stored, right? And there will be a day when you will plug in your EV. It will be sit there plugged in, and some piece of software would tell it, give the grid some energy because it needs it right now, and it'll pay you for that. And then later on, there's plenty of electricity because it's sunny or windy, and your vehicle will take it back to the grid because it's really cheap then. And this helps us balance the whole thing out. So those technologies, they're done. In other words, they have won. It's just a question of, do we get to 100% by 2050? Everything is sort of focused on 2050. Are we less than 100% by 2050? That's really the only question. It's hard to say at this point, but it looks good. Then you get into stuff that definitely is not one yet because it's too early. To me, the most exciting area is green hydrogen. And the only reason I say it's exciting is because if green hydrogen scales up, which means the price point comes down by a factor of about $6 a kilo or by $1 a kilo. And you get the infrastructure to produce it and move it at scale, pipes and everything that goes with that. That's a big if, but if that happens, green hydrogen allows us to decarbonize a huge chunk of the economy that at the moment's pretty hard to decarbonize. And this is everything from like long haul trucking to airplanes to steel production, heavy industry, heating, a huge number of things. And so that's really exciting. I also think incredibly big challenge. I would say what's going on in agriculture and food production, pretty exciting too, really exciting. It's not a sort of a green hydrogen sort of it'll either happen at scale or it won't. Food and ag are really exciting because they're not a one-all. There's so many thousands of really interesting strategies and technologies and ways of doing this. And taken together, we could see a whole change in our whole food system, which is exciting from a client perspective, also maybe exciting from a health perspective too. May allow us to produce more healthier, better food. And then, I would say direct air capture. It's exciting because at the end of the day, we'll probably have to some of it anyway. The price point today is extraordinarily high, but there are reasons to think that it could come down enough that it could be a nice, that nice last piece of the puzzle that we just can't figure out any other way to get to. And it seems a little insane to go around sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere as a way to solve our problem. But we know it can be done. I mean, biomass, trees, plant matter has been doing it forever. It's certainly feasible. We just need to be a lot smarter about it. And I'm very skeptical of the just plant more trees that solves the problem. I've seen too many ways it goes wrong, and we need to do that better. But I think air direct air capture is an interesting piece of this as well.
Do you see a possibility in the direct air capture space for it to become more viable because the carbon capture can then be used in other products and actually can have a certain value rather than just being, something that gets put in a storage unit?
Yeah, I think so. But my understanding from the data, and I'm definitely not an expert in this, is that the applicable use is pretty small. In other words, that's a good way to get some early value out of carbon capture and help drive down, help increase the demand for it and therefore increase the scale and therefore drive down the cost, which is really important in these new technologies. But there's only so much you can, it's only so many carbonated beverages we drink, even though it seems to be a lot. Obviously you can use it for more than that. There's potential use in cement production, some other, even as a fuel. But I think ultimately we're going to end up storing CO2 underground. And I don't, the science I've seen on it doesn't say that's a bad idea. It's safe and permanent. It works. There's a lot of work in that area, and it's, we take a lot of stuff out from the ground. There's a lot of place to put it back. Most of them taking out fossil fuels. The issue is, and again, this is based on science I've read, not from any sort of research I've done directly. The physics of pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere is very, very difficult. We think, oh my gosh, there's 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's terrifying. But put that formula in reverse. How do you, if there's 1 million parts in the atmosphere and you're looking for the 422 that are CO2, how do you find that and capture it? And it's up in the stratosphere. Not such a simple endeavor. And,
yeah, certainly.
And that's the cost. That's the problem.
Fair enough. Fair play. I'd like to talk a little bit, since you have a background in finance and built a company in this space. Could you talk about the investment sector's general outlook on climate change and the evolution of it over the past 20 years or so?
Yeah, I would say that first, in terms of the evolution of it, there is increasing knowledge. So 20 years ago, I don't think anyone in the investment sector knew anything about climate change, and certainly I was in that category. And it was just the story I told you earlier about my brother. That was a fluke that I started to educate myself. Obviously, there's always been a few people, like anywhere, there are a few people who are personally interested, but that's been small. What's changed in the investment sector today, I think, is becoming broadly aware, slowly but surely. Still, I still think it's probably, not everyone, but it's becoming much, much more mainstream. We certainly see that in the business school, a number of students who are both studying finance and intending to go into the investment industry, but are aware and very concerned about climate change. What's changed is that the investment industry now is something that they can actually do. In other words, they can actually do their job, invest, and help decarbonize. And the primary sector is through renewables. In other words, renewable industry, as I mentioned earlier, is a multi-$100 billion a year industry. That's a lot of investment capital being put to work. So you see whole divisions of companies saying, we need to be in this business. We're losing opportunity. They also want to be in this business for a couple other reasons. Their employees want it. So increasingly, we see companies globally, I'd say, especially in Europe, but now for sure in the US and other countries, where employees are saying, what's my company doing about climate change? What's my company doing about sustainability? And all things being equal, I want to work for a company that cares about that. And in fact, one of my colleagues at the business school, Vanessa Bourbon, she's a professor, she's done some interesting research around this, how employees show a mark, particularly younger employees, show a clear preference to work for companies they think are sustainable. And then there's consumers. These are more for consumer product companies. There's evidence that consumers prefer sustainable products. And now you've got investors. And what's going on in the investor world is a bit there's a lot of controversy around it, and it falls under this term. The broad term is ESG investing. I'll get into the controversy in a second, but there's a lot of investors now sort of applying an ESG lens to their investments, and so they are looking for investments that have less climate risk and are viewed as more sustainable. So there's capital sort of looking for these opportunities. So you have all these trends, and actually in my book, I start the book by writing about these trends, these macro trends. And then lastly, I think the average human today is just more aware of climate change because of the rising physical manifestation of it. Again, 20 years ago, you didn't see climate change that much. Unfortunately, in this, unsurprisingly, you see more and more evidence that it's real, and people become aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's something, I don't recall a lot of it from growing up because it was really not something talked about, but other than in a negative light, like, oh, it's just global warming. So what, we're in Wisconsin, we get hot winters, we get cold winters, blah, blah, blah. Like Wisconsin, has crazy weather, right? So it's like, a lot of people didn't talk about it that way. And I think that perhaps maybe there was a mistake in calling it global warming because a lot of people are like, oh yeah, so what's going to happen? It's just going to heat up a bit. I know people in Wisconsin wouldn't mind that. Usually they're like, oh, it'll be warm.
No, I grew up in Canada. There are moments I'm like,
exactly.
Isn't bad this lovely warm day. And in all seriousness, let me say serious level. One of the issues around climate change is, and I tell my students, that climate change is two words. There's the climate part of it and the change part of it. And obviously people think about climate changing, but more than climate changing, everything's going to change. Our economy is going to change. Where the jobs are going to be is going to change. Where people are going to be able to live is going to change a bit too, and so on. The problem with change is it's hard on people. Most people don't want change. And the reason it's hard is because some people benefit from change and many people don't. When it comes to climate change, most people will not benefit. But that's not entirely true that everybody's going to suffer from climate change. And, parts of Canada, for example, it's not just going to get warmer, but for example, from an agriculture perspective, wide swaths of Canada are going to be much more habitable. It's not the right word, habitable. Are going to be available for agriculture. I read an interesting statistic before the Russian war and invasion of Ukraine. I think the statistic was from like 2020 or 2019, pre-pandemic, that Russian agriculture had significantly benefited from climate change, from warming, to the point that Russian exports of agricultural products had surpassed exports of weapons for the first time ever. Now, Russia exports a lot of weapons. I don't know the magnitude of the numbers, but it was a telling statistic. So the reason I put that out there is not to go, oh, that's really great for Russia or great for Canada. To say that I think if everybody clearly recognized, wow, climate change is going to hurt me. It's bad for me. It's bad for my neighbors. It's bad for everybody on the planet. It would be a little bit easier to deal with. Actually, it's not that simple, right? Some people, their lives are going to be, the place where they live is going to get destroyed. There's nothing they can do. It's terrible. Other people are going to, have change in industries. Other people are going to face terrible heat, but they'll get by, and there's so many different ways of outcomes here. This complicates it a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very difficult, I think, because it's a lot of people like to apply, hey, this is just how it is, but they also forget that there's very different opinions and very different lifestyles. Like when I moved from Wisconsin to New York, I started to learn a very different type of way of looking at the world, right? And then now I confuse the two when a lot of people have no idea why people in Wisconsin think the way they do, and they don't, and vice versa.
And that came back to my earlier point in our discussion, Silas, which is I think it's really important that we don't make assumptions about what other people think about climate change or other issues, but we'll just stick to climate change right now. People have different reasons for being concerned about climate change, for taking action on it, and so on. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't constantly, be pushing on this issue and trying to move the ball on reducing emissions. That has to be sort of our focus and our North Star here. But we need to recognize different people in different regions are going to have a different perspective on this and understand where they're coming from. And then what is it that would, allow them or help them to change their perspective if it's not one around decarbonizing.
Yeah, certainly. What one, we're running out of time here, but I do want to talk about, since you mentioned policy a few times, and then you've done a bit of studying on what other countries are doing, for example. Could you talk about some of the maybe relatively simple solutions or things that you would note that could be really relatively easily achieved and actually create a lot of benefits towards solving climate change on the policy side of things, and how that might look and be administered for people who are a bit skeptical of policy?
Yeah. So first of all, policy it's not effective in a vacuum, right? It's not like you pass policy and that solves the problem. Policy doesn't solve the problem. Policy has to basically catalyze business and consumer behavior. Otherwise, you're sort of wasting your time and money, right? So that's the important thing. And secondly, the policy action should be focused so that it's relatively short-lived. In other words, if the action is we need to put in place a policy that's going to last forever and never be changed, we're just going to do X and that solves the problem. That's not going to work because, first of all, if it's subsidies, you can't subsidize things forever. And secondly, if it's sort of regulatory, things are going to change. So the policies have to change too. So what would be a good example of that? Well, I mentioned earlier, the Inflation Reduction Act is a really good example of that. And the reason is that, first of all, it doesn't say, well, here's our solution to climate change. It says there's dozens of technologies out there and they need different things. Some of them just need a little more subsidy to keep that scale going, renewables and electric vehicles. And for example, electric vehicles, what piece of it is the battery piece that needs to bring down the cost, and it's that charging infrastructure we need to build that out. So it's targeted. The numbers are big, but the numbers actually are much bigger than people realize because the 369 billion in funding, that's a big number, right? But the way it's designed, it provides a subsidy that will unlock a lot of private capital, because investors and developers and business owners will go, wow, if I do X, I was thinking about doing, but I couldn't sell this product, it's too expensive and so on, or I don't have as many customers because it's expensive. If I do this, I can now drop the price because there's a subsidy. And now my business is going to grow 5X. I got to invest in that too. So the estimates are that for that 369 billion, there's at least $1 trillion in capital coming in. So it's a clever bill because it's not just about government money; it's actually unlocking an enormous amount of private capital. And that only happens if people actually build stuff and make the investments. It's not like the money goes at the door first. Almost all of this is in tax credits, which is a very complicated way of providing a subsidy. But in this case, you only get it after you've built whatever you're building. So it's sort of, you have to do it, and then you get the piece of it. And then the last part, as I said, it's a lot of different technologies, and I don't necessarily believe all those technologies. I mean, let's take nuclear, for example. There's money in there for nuclear. Why don't I believe nuclear? It's actually not around the safety issue, though. It's obviously something to be aware of. But nuclear actually has an extraordinarily good safety record. The issue is in nuclear is really costly. It's an unbelievably expensive way to produce power. The reason that funding is in there is because there's some new technologies that, in theory, it's more than just theory. There's some technology that suggests that the cost of these new nuclear facilities will come down really dramatically. And somewhere in the next, by the late 2029, 2030, we'll have our first new nuclear plants here in the US that will be both cheap, they're smaller, so they're more distributable. Of course, they're zero emission and very safe based on these new technologies. That's possible. And I am fine with the government providing a little bit of incentive to develop that technology. It's relatively small in the whole context. Do I personally think it's going to work? I'm doubtful. I think by the time these first nuclear plants are built, and they'll never be built in time, because I've never seen anything nuclear happen on time. Solar and wind and energy storage will be so darn cheap by that point that, nuclear's not gonna catch up. But I'm fine to be proven wrong on that. You know what? If it turns out when nuclear engineers knock this one out of the park, that's great. So that Inflation Reduction Act kind of provides a little bit of something for everyone. And then back to your point about, whether it's Wisconsin or any other part of the country, everywhere in the country, there's people who are going to be building stuff on this act. And that to me is really important. In fact, the Bloomberg report suggests that the majority of the dollars are going to be spent in Republican controlled states. And those states are not voting for climate change. I mean, not a single Republican voted for that bill. But once those businesses hire people and expand and build more, I don't see that bill going away. I don't see that act changing because it becomes sort of embedded in the economy and people's lives. And I think it's going to have real big impact there. So that's a piece of policy that I think is really, really well done. Where we're missing policy, and really missing policy, and I don't know when or how it's going to happen, is around pricing carbon. There is no global pricing carbon, and around carbon credits. So carbon credits are kind of a tricky thing. It's pretty hard. Let me rephrase it. I don't see a path to net zero emissions without carbon credits. You had so many businesses who emit greenhouse gases. You can't get to zero. Some of them, it's just impossible. So they got to have some way to offset their emissions, and that's what carbon credits allow them to do. And they allow them to do it in a economically effective way. So you don't just destroy these businesses and products and jobs to go with them. Say like steel, for example. The problem is today there isn't a good carbon market out there. It's all voluntary by and large. It's unregulated. A lot of the projects are not actually reducing greenhouse gas. They're not what we call additional. And, that's not helping. So we need policy that creates really, really serious carbon markets, and we're far from that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One other thing that I think you mentioned earlier, which I did want to highlight, I think I'm not sure exactly how this could be changed, but I know that from working as a recruiter in the space too, that the permitting issue takes, if you can at least shorten the permitting period or make it more expedited somehow, that could get things.
Yeah. That's the other part policy-wise. We got this great bill with funding and so on, but there was supposed to be a follow-on permitting bill, and it's kind of died. I don't, that's politics. But that it would be really good if we could expedite permitting. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that my hope is that there's going to be a lot of benefits from what you mentioned on the Republican and slash kind of voting against climate, at least controlled states. When the people start to see the benefit, hopefully, if democracy works the way it's supposed to, the representatives will actually be supported by their districts to vote for these things, right? And to realize like these are actually beneficial.
Yeah, I'm not super optimistic, but that comes back to the rise of nationalism at the national level, and then you're within the U.S. we're pretty divided. On the other hand, sometimes it's just semantics. It's just politics, right? I mean, politicians will make a huge deal because that's how they get elected. They make a lot of noise. Mm-hmm. This whole debate around ESG investing, got a bunch of Republican politicians making a huge noise about it. You know what? It's pure politics. They don't know anything about ESG. They're not investors. It's kind of just making noise. And I'm hoping the same here. If some Republicans make noise around climate change, I think it's really unfortunate. I think it's crazy. This shouldn't be a politicized issue. It's an economic problem. But as long as at the end of the day we can build stuff and get things done to decarbonize, the political show is hopefully a bit of a sideshow. Mm-hmm. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some point we'll probably see, at least my hope is that we'll see kind of the situation with Australia. Obviously, it's not necessarily a positive thing, but because they're so badly affected by climate change, it's not a matter of for or against climate change policies for the politicians. It's just, what is your plan? Like, what is your plan?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. At the end of the day, you need a plan. Everyone's eventually going to need a plan one day, and sooner the better. I'm
Absolutely.
unfortunately cognizant of time here. I'm going to have to go very short.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think this has been a really great discussion overall. I really appreciate you being able to fill us in a bit on the COP27 and talking about your book a bit. I think it's really fascinating to hear coming from your background and then going into building what you're doing. And I think I don't really have a lot of people from academia in here, so I think it's interesting to be able to talk to you since you're probably in some interesting circles with that. Any, I guess, final things for people that you want to recommend to people? Of course, I recommend, of course, people get the book. I know I have it actually in my Amazon cart already. But any final thoughts you want to offer?
And the final thought I would offer is, I think it's important what people do in their personal lives when it comes to climate change, and whether it's, I like to bike, or food you eat and things that, I think it's important that you essentially align your values with your personal consumption behavior. But if you are, if you really do care about climate change a great deal, for most people, and I think most of your listeners, you're going to have a greater impact through your work than your personal consumption. And that's because through your work, most people have more influence. I mean, through your podcast, you're going to reach more people and have more influence than just through your personal behavior. And I think that's true for most of it. So I really encourage people, and I say, and it sounds, students ask, well, what am I supposed to do with my work? And I'm like, look at your business, look at your industry, look at what, it doesn't matter what you do, nonprofit, government, whatever role you're in, how can you influence your peers in your organization to put us in the right direction here and push hard on that, because that can really make a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think people speak with their feet, right? If they move to another company, especially in this day where, unfortunately, a lot of people are treated kind of just like numbers in the company, go to some place where it's going to be beneficial. I know, obviously, we've seen a lot of layoffs in tech recently, and I think that I am optimistic. Maybe I just, because I'm very optimistic always, but that people will use this opportunity to actually rethink their life and think, hey, should I be going for the job that's maybe not necessarily making a positive impact on climate change? And yeah, I'm getting paid 200, 300 grand, but maybe I can make a little less and actually make an impact on something, right? And I know, being in recruitment, it's really hard to convince people to take that step backwards on the compensation piece of things. But if they really care about the work, and if they care about this problem, they should be getting after it at this level with their good skills. So very good. Well, I appreciate you having you on. It's been great, and we'll definitely look forward to seeing more from what you're doing, and continue to follow your journey.
All right, thanks guys so much for listening to today's episode. Please let us know what you thought of the show. You can reach out to us over Twitter, Slack, or LinkedIn, or email, however you prefer. Always very curious to hear your thoughts, potential topics you'd like to hear more about. If you're interested in getting into the space, I'm always glad to chat with individuals and see what I can do to try to help people get into the space. And again, please do share this with somebody who might also find it interesting, as it is our goal to share and help people learn about what's going on in the space. I think so many people are just unaware of these things, which is why we started the show, to hopefully create some resources that can be shared around, mainly for people to learn and to understand the benefits of ClimateTech beyond just the kind of the key one, which is obviously climate change and solving climate change. There's usually so many more benefits also to these technologies, so definitely reach out and share this around with somebody who might find it interesting. Please do consider reaching out to Bruce if you're keen to learn more. I would recommend you checking out his book, which is linked in the description on Amazon. And then if you are joining us for the first time and you enjoyed the show, please do subscribe and turn on notifications. We also very much appreciate ratings and reviews. It doesn't take you very long. If you can just give us probably a minute of your time to give us a quick review on Apple, if you enjoyed it, would really, really appreciate that, as it helps us to grow the rankings and then get out to more people. Quick note, on our next episode, we will be joined with Aaron Fitzgerald, the CEO and founder of Mars Materials, where they are creating a clean, ACN is the technology or the product, but if I pronounce it correctly, it's acrylonitrile, again, also usually referred to as ACN. They are creating an alternative for this, which is much more sustainable, and essentially what they're doing is they're sequestering carbon into this product, and it's in a way that it really just pretty much straight away integrates with companies who use this chemical. And this may not be something you have heard of from a chemical perspective, but it's actually something that almost every person has used in their daily basis. It's a chemical used in the production of many, many plastics. So, for example, most keyboards are made from it. There's all kinds of products that are made from it. So it's really, really fascinating what they're doing. And generally speaking, I really, really enjoyed the conversation because I think Aaron has his journey and his background is very fascinating to me. And on top of that, the technology they're working on is super, super epic. And then one other thing that I think was really, really cool is he relayed how they came about the technology from the NREL program. And he also relays how other founders can apply to be part of this. So NREL has a lot of these technologies that are not commercialized yet, but that have been researched and basically to some extent proven. And someone can come in and demonstrate the right capabilities and go and take one of these technologies and go commercialize it. So it's really, really cool program. And I think that's probably one of the most valuable things to aspiring entrepreneurs listening. So go check that episode out when it comes out very soon. And we thank you so much again for listening to CleanTechies the podcast, and we will see you next time on the show.